Oh God, our churches, our communities, the people we serve have been under levels of stress and strain related to the pandemic. May this evening's conversation bring a moment of light in the midst of challenge, a moment of hope in the midst of anxiety. We find you, our creator, in community. In these times, often community is gathered on a screen like we are tonight. As we come together to share in this time of learning with one another, help us to be open to your wisdom and grace this evening. Guide us in our understanding that we might explore new ways to live our faith in this extraordinary time. We give thanks for each person connected with us this evening and for those that have supported this work and made this gathering possible. May your blessing be upon this time, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Tammy. And so why don't you continue and you can introduce yourself, and then we'll invite Loraine to introduce herself, and I'm just going to take the spotlight off me, but I'm here in the background. If you need me, just call my name.
Sounds good. So my name is Tammy Allan. I serve the pastoral charge of Olds and Sundry United Churches in South Central Alberta. And in 2019, I had sabbatical, my second sabbatical, and this one I wanted to focus on kind of best practices in rural churches that are flourishing or thriving, to see what I might learn from them and how I might share that in my area of the province, of the country. For personal reasons, I had to limit my scope of travel to the prairie provinces primarily. And I did find that in doing that, my timing, because I started in the fall, folks wanted to avoid visits in the startup time and on Thanksgiving Sunday. So I kind of had to peg myself in different places around those times. But everywhere I went, it's a warm welcome. It just, the sabbatical work, prairie provinces and a bit into BC, and every United Church I visited just felt like another home away from home. So I'm really appreciative that Loraine actually invited me into this work, and I'll let her tell you a bit about how she came to this place.
Thanks, Tammy. So I too had a sabbatical in 2019, and I'm from Westworth United Church. That's the church I'm ministering and serving at this moment, and have been for I think I'm into my 8th year, 7.5 years anyway, something like that, in Winnipeg. And I love it. I love the church. It's a great church. We've done a number of fun things. And I was running out of ideas. I thought, I'm sure that there are other things that would be great for us to help us thrive a little bit more even. And that is what led to the sabbatical. I knew I needed to read books and to visit others who were finding some ways of thriving, in ways that I could learn from. As I phoned conference personnel ministers where I started across Canada to get from them ideas of churches I could visit, it became clear pretty quickly that conference personnel ministers are largely involved with churches that aren't thriving. So they did have a number of ideas, but I think the group that gave me the greatest number of ideas was the group called the Below Average Ministers of the United Church of Canada. It's called something like that. And the name refers to, Tammy, tell me, what's the name refer to? You're part of that.
It is below average, but and that's average age of ministers in the United Church. And I'm about to hit my 6th decade and I'm still in it.
All right. And I'm just sort of a titch older than that, so I've missed out. They were the ones who were the most helpful in giving some suggestions for churches that I could learn from. I plan to visit coast to coast. Unfortunately, money and time did not allow me to visit coast to coast, because that would have been amazing. I quickly discovered that there are many more thriving churches than I had Sundays to visit. So
Mhm.
that allowed me to actually choose ones that were closer to family and friends and beautiful hiking places, because after all, the sabbatical is also meant to be a time of rest and rejuvenation. And so I mentioned it in the book that Tammy and I have written, that there are so many more churches, United Churches, that are thriving that we have named or visited. And so if any of you, I'm sure there's a number of you on this call even today who are thriving, please do not take it personally that we didn't visit you. It's just a matter of time. So that's actually the good news. The good news is that what we hear in the media about mainline churches, and especially the United Church, dying, well, it's not all true. So take that from tonight and say, you know, we can beat those stats. In my exploration of where to go, I think it was the Below Average group that told me about Tammy and her sabbatical. So I quickly connected with her, and we decided that we would. I don't know. We hadn't planned on writing a book, I don't think, that early, but we wanted to. I'm not sure where that started, where the seed started.
When you touched base with me, you had already been asked to consider publishing your work. And you asked me if I was interested in being a part of that.
Okay, so my sabbatical took place May, June, May through July. That's right. And then I had already written my report up. And that's right. And people were asking if they could. They were encouraging me to publish it. They said there are so many things that you're learning that are really important for the wider church to learn. So, like, don't keep it to yourself. They were begging me to kind of get it out there. So that, yeah, that's right. And so then I thought, you know, we need rural as well as urban. I largely focused on urban, although one of my churches, two of them were sort of half urban, half rural. But yeah, so that's how our teaming ended up happening in our writing together. Yeah.
And I think I should say that Loraine and I had never met before we did this. This was like, we've met in person twice, twice.
Once, I think.
Once in Manitoba. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it's just been lovely working with Tammy. It's yeah, it's great. So I think, where are we in this? I think we're down to the definition, maybe, are we?
Yeah.
Okay,
And actually somebody in the chat had asked for that.
okay, all right. So I began with a definition. It was my hunch that this is what was involved in thriving churches. So I'm going to screen share my PowerPoint, and this should, let's just see, play from start. Let's just see if I've done this right. Okay.
So click the green button that says screen share, and then you get a pop-up that shows you all your applications that are open.
Yeah.
Choose the application you want to share.
Yeah. So I think I've done it right.
Let me just share button is the blue one on the right-hand corner. That's it.
That's it.
There we go.
Are you seeing the right screen? Okay, right. So this is the definition of, well, I know what I want to do before I got to this. I'd like you to throw in the chat box, all of you, what you think is a description or definition of a thriving church. So let's just take a few minutes to do that. I'm going to stop the share and allow you to put in the chat box what you think would be important for a thriving church. Let's just popcorn it, just pop it in. And I'll name things as they're going in. Oh yeah, this is great. New ministries, engagement, growing programs, multi-generational. The children are part of many different ways. Learning church, growing, making a difference. Healthy, minimal conflict. That was not actually right, according to what we found, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Growing, stable membership, multi-generational, growing, spiritually nurturing. Spiritually nurturing. You've got something there. We're going to come back to that one. Not numbers. Clear, like that. Clear sense of mission, shared purpose and action, active members in all age groups, enthusiasm, energy, engaged in community. young people and children, not obsessed with just thriving. A place that is safe. Oh, you know what? They just go on and on. And wow, you are great. You know, I think we're done. Okay, we're finished the webinar. Okay, all right. Boy, you pretty much have it right on. There's a few comments that do beg some further comment. So I might look through those in a bit. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. I'll reshare it. And you will see what I have been able to. Uh-oh, I've lost my first page now. How do I do this? Oh, shoot. Hang on a second.
While Lorraine's looking for that, I will add that a couple of people did mention financial reality. So financially secure and fiscally secure were a couple of them I think that came up.
Right. Yes. Thank you for that. Yeah. So maybe you can keep watching that, Tammy, while I put some of these things up here then. So the first thing that I said was consistent or growing membership. We have so many people who are dying that I think if we can be consistent in our membership, that alone says something. But, growing is nice. They're going to see if they're seeing this. The second thing, desktop 2, is, whoops. Oh dear, what happened there? I'm hitting the wrong one. There we go. Financially stable. So again, I'm not saying increasing in finances, but stable.
Loraine, I'm just going to interrupt to say we're not sharing your screen right now.
Oh, you're not seeing it?
So again, go back and hit that green share screen button.
Okay.
Look at the pop-up that shows you all the applications you have open.
Oh, I forgot to push the share.
There
we go.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, so consistent or growing membership, financially stable, engage young people, make meaningful contributions to neighborhood, city, world. And I should say before, this is going to be recorded. Did you mention that, Stephen?
Yeah.
So you don't need to write all this down. I'm going to go through some lists pretty quickly, so don't try to copy it all down. You can get a recording of this later. Well, even better, you can buy the book, but okay. Make meaningful contributions to neighborhood, city, world, offer challenging, inspirational, and creative worship, offer educational opportunities for all ages, provide supportive faith community for diverse identities. So in that, you might hear where I'm talking about intercultural there. Participate in justice partnerships, foster interfaith and intercultural relationships. Whoops, there we go. So that's the list I came up with before I went on my sabbatical. That's what I was looking for. I looked through the ROP to try to look at some of the stats around some of this, and that's how I determined which churches to go to. Most of that list did hold true, but not necessarily all of it. The ROP means the record of proceedings, sorry, from the General Council. That has all the stats for all the churches. So as I began to visit the churches, Nancy and I together, as we traveled together, and Nancy was a great help in both. She helped with some of the interviewing and visiting, and then with the writing at the end. She actually wrote one little part of the book too, and was a great person to run stuff off. And so one of the things that we talked about as we were visiting was that we became aware that the commonalities between the churches were not what they were doing, but who they were. That was key. Who they were determined what they would do. But what they did was different because every context demanded a different type of ministry. This led to an aha about spiritual attributes. And so we began to identify spiritual attributes that they shared in common. That was the way of being. Similar to the biblical descriptions of attributes in like Romans 12 and the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. Those would be examples of lists of attributes of some of the early churches. And I began to connect some of the attributes we were seeing to descriptions of those same attributes in the epistles and the book of Acts, describing the early followers of what was called the Way before they became the church. Some of these attributes, well, these are the main ones that I talk about in the book. And oops, I didn't do my, oops, well, I was going to do a, there it is all at once. It was supposed to be coming in.
That's your definition of thriving churches.
Oh, I see. That's why. There it is. I'm sorry. There it is. Okay. So the first attribute we realized they were visionary. They were able to hold vision. Radically hospitable. And we'll be talking a bit more about that later. That is full of all sorts of things. Joyful. When we walked into the church, we had a distinct, every church we were visited, we had this very strong, overwhelming sense of joy, a very positive attitude. I wasn't necessarily used to that in other churches that I visited, right? So that's why I think it stood out so much. It was quite remarkable. Communal, there was a priority of communion with each other. They really wanted to be together. So relationships were integral to these churches. Accountable, they were accountable for behavior. Lacking conflict? No, absolutely not. In many of the churches we visited, they talked about how they were dealing with conflict, but conflict was there. So it is not an absence of conflict. It's a commitment to address conflict, sometimes have difficult conversations, even if it means some people leave the church. Better that than not addressing conflict and allowing those who might be bullying, might be exhibiting some inappropriate behavior to not be challenged. That was, one church in particular named that as a very important piece of why they started growing. Accountable, and so that's the accountable one. Humble, another one. There was a sense of being together. There was no one, as far as we could see, no one eagle that jumped out over the rest. Certainly humble in the sense of their spirituality. Open-hearted, not closed-hearted, open-hearted. Risk-taking was a big piece of it. A number of them were taking financial risks, but responsible financial risks. That was interesting. A number of them had financial challenges, so it was not a lack of financial challenges. And part of it was they took on risks that some of the rest of us would not necessarily take on, but in a very carefully calculated, responsible way. But it's not just financial risks that they were talking about here. Discerning, they had a program of ongoing discernment about the Spirit's leading, about the community assessment, because communities change all the time, nothing's static. So discernment needs to be ongoing. It's not a done, check, move on to something else. Contemplative. A number, if not most, if not all actually, of these churches spent significant time in silent meditation, in contemplation, in prayer. That was a very important part of their discernment. Mission focused, so they certainly were not focused only on themselves, which is what happens when churches move into a survival mode. They then turn inward. These churches were looked after one another, but also looked after those beyond their walls. So mission focused was definitely part of it. Generous. There was a generosity in giving, financial giving within the congregation, generous in giving time and gifts of skills within and beyond the church. Offering public witness. It was very important for, and some more than others, but some of the churches were talked significantly about having a very visible vocal presence in their community through media, through wearing clerical collars for clergy in the community. So there could be a visible presence of a United Church voice that often offers a bit of a different voice than some of the other public voices that are out there. Particularly lately, I might add. But anyway, And innovative. I think that's the last thing there. And the innovative part became really important last year. And we'll be talking a bit about the COVID test of these churches. So just one last PowerPoint here. How am I doing time-wise, Tammy?
We're a couple of minutes
Behind.
past where we,
Okay,
behind,
all right.
but
Tammy's,
we're doing okay.
We're doing okay. All right. Tammy's the timekeeper. That's never my forte, as my partner will agree. Okay. So now this is just a really quick overview of what we're going to do in these 3 sessions. We're going to talk about some of what we found, a little more in depth about some of these spiritual attributes. And the first chapter of the book talks about the attributes. The second chapter talks about the characteristics, what came out of those attributes. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of these in these 3 sessions. Today, we're going to try to touch on inspirational worship, spiritual formation, contemplation, joyful and communal. Next week, we'll be talking about discerning, innovative, and collegial, what that looked like. And Tammy and I will be giving lots of examples of specific examples of some of these. The third session, we'll be talking about radical hospitality, mission-focused, and offering public witness. Within each of these 3 sessions, after talking about some of these spiritual attributes and characteristics, we'll then bring the COVID test to these churches. Tammy and I contacted all of the churches we visited again last spring to see how they were doing in the midst of COVID, like in May and June, I think. Was it Tammy? May,
Yeah,
June,
I think it was, yeah.
And then we want to bring it home to each of you. So at that point, we're going to move into small groups. Those of you who came together with others in the congregation, in your congregation, we'll be putting you together so you can talk about how to bring home some of these things to your church. And those of you who are not with others in your congregation will be mixed with others, and you might learn from others from what's happening in their churches. So the very last half hour or so will be, or 45 minutes, we'll be talking about that. So that's what the sessions will look like. That's how our outline's going to go. I think we can move now into the first topic, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, but we're going to be looking tonight at inspirational worship, spiritual formation. Can you see my mouse?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Contemplative, joyful, and communal. So we're going to move right now into inspirational worship, and I will stop sharing the screen so that we can see one another a little better. Okay. So inspirational worship, I found that that this was key to, and it's one of the reasons we're starting with this. Creative worship heightens curiosity and expectation. It's often, I think almost every church we visited, it spilled past the hour. So those who are really concerned about ending up the exact minute of the hour may miss some priorities there, because creative worship is a bit unpredictable and often takes you past the hour, and no one seemed to be worried about that because they were so thrilled about the creativity. Charles Wood is one example. Michael Wilson at Charles Wood United in Winnipeg said that every Sunday they do something different, and people do not want to miss a service because they're so curious as to what is going to happen in that service. Preaching is dynamic, relational, and relevant with depth and substance. That again is really important. It was clear that all of the ministers took at least a day, if not 2 days, to prepare for sermons, because you can't do that in just a rushed preparation time. Technology was not the be all and end all. It was an aid. In most of the churches, I found they used screens and that, but not necessarily all. But it certainly wasn't the focus. That's really important to think about. How does it aid you, but not how can it bring people in? The liturgical style and theology varied. So some churches were conservative in their theology. Others were more on the radical edge of theology. And this liturgical style matched the theology, is what I found. So those with a little more formal style, well, that's not true. I should take that back. Some had a higher liturgy, but were still more on the sort of radical edge of theology. So it was mixed. Certainly matched what the congregation was comfortable with and looking for. And then the last thing I found was that music, again, was central. I was very surprised to see that most of the churches did not have a choir, or at least a choir that sang every Sunday. They had very varied music groups, sometimes solos only, sometimes duets, a choral group. It could be the choir that might sing off and on. They focused on music that would relate to that particular Sunday's theme, and had enough musicians where they could have that option of a variety of music. But I think the key here was a variety of music styles. Tammy, what did you find?
Okay. I also found that lots of creative worship, lots of different things happening everywhere I went. And some were intergenerational almost every Sunday, and some that was just more of an occasional thing. I also found that each worship service was a blend of traditional and contemporary. Again, because you're in a rural church, your demographics are a blend of needs, and you're one church in a community. But the preaching was very relational, and again, relevancy, particularly to the rural context and what was happening economically, socially in the community. Everywhere I went, that was touched on. In worship, wherever the places I went, most of them were not. Now this is changing because of COVID, but most of them were not tech savvy. There was one that was doing live streaming to accommodate 2 churches worshiping at the same time, but technology was not a big priority. Music certainly was, but not rarely in the congregations I visited were there paid professional musicians. Some were professional musicians in another realm of their life, but their work with the church was either volunteer or honorarium. Often only one musician, rarely a choir or just a pickup choir for special occasions. But each of the churches I visited very clearly said music was vital to their ministry. So that's kind of the inspirational side of what I saw.
Great, thanks, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
So we move to the second thing, and that's spiritual formation. This was a constant throughout all of the churches I went to. There was an emphasis not only on spiritual growth with children, there's Sunday school, for instance, but also for adults. So people attending were given many opportunities to develop their own faith, and certainly small groups were an important part of that, where relationships with one another could also be developed. But there was a significant emphasis on spiritual growth. Again, not something I find very often in a lot of churches. And there was a keen interest in the congregants in developing their own faith maturity and learning how to do that. Some churches made sure that they had at least one adult educational group that was ongoing, happening all the time throughout the year. So there was always at least one. Some churches had a very strong emphasis on discernment of spiritual gifts. And there was one church in particular that I didn't visit and I wished I'd had time to, and that's Canadian Memorial. But it has a very strong focus on, in BC, a very strong focus on spiritual discernment. And everyone is expected to go through that program to discern their gifts and then find ways to put those gifts into practice. There was another church in Bedford that we visited, and a number of people came up to us and said, as soon as you come in the door, you are welcome into finding your place, and that place meant to get involved immediately in something. So they said, when you come into this church, you can't just sit in the pew. You will find yourself swept into the action and ministry of the church. It didn't mean being placed on a committee, but it meant helping people find meaningful opportunities for ministry from the beginning.
Like digging deeper.
Like one of their spiritual groups was called Digging Deeper. That was their spiritual formation, and they had some really creative, interesting speakers and books they were reading for that group. There's another church, and Dave Anderson I see as part of this. So here's an example. There are some of the churches we visited are on this call. Now, I wasn't expecting that because I'm basically telling everyone what I've learned from them. But I think that shows how committed they are to constant learning. And that is one of the key elements of thriving churches. They are committed to constant learning. So Dave Anderson from Eagle Ridge is on this call. I saw him, and I think some of his congregants. One of the churches we visited, they have an emphasis on discipleship. And they talked about a discipleship focus means a focus on spiritual growth and leadership training versus what's called a membership focus. A membership focus is on numerical increase in numbers and in finances. So if your focus is on discipleship, you're not worried about the numbers, you're worried about spiritual growth and leadership training. If that happens, the numbers will follow, is what they taught me. And in fact, that has been their experience. Tammy.
Excuse me, in the rural settings, there was equally an importance put on spiritual development, spiritual formation. The rural dynamic is that in several of the churches I visited, people came from a distance or lived in other communities. So for example, Balzac, which some would think isn't really rural because it's sort of nestled in between Calgary and Airdrie. But Balzac is a small church in the midst of two big cities. They do all their spiritual formation on Sunday after church. So they would have their regular worship, and then everybody stays for lunch. And they don't do this every Sunday, but everybody stays for lunch, and they do a program that is for all ages. It's themed around the desires and the needs of the congregants. So the one day they were doing something that some of the children were interested in. They also often, in the places I went, Bible studies or say Lenten studies or Advent studies were ecumenically based, because there's several small mainline churches in a community. The ministerial would get together and plan something, and it would be an ecumenical study. So a broad theological basis, but coming together to develop understanding and fellowship and community. And several of the churches, a couple of the churches focused on providing learning for all ages at the same time, again, to cut down travel and whatnot. Want to move to contemplative?
Mm-hmm. So contemplative, these next ones we'll be going through a little faster because I actually already said a bit about them, but the spiritual connection was central. Prayers, meditation at every meeting and every small group gathering. The commitment to developing a deep spiritual practice that sustains ministry. Many of them were talked about following Richard Rohr's daily email meditations. And he comes out of it, it's called the Center for Action and Contemplation. I highly recommend those. In fact, one of the churches has talked about, well, we're moving into the COVID. We're moving into the COVID. I'll talk about that later. Yeah. Okay. Tammy, over to you.
Again, it's very similar. Every group meeting would begin with prayer or some spiritual reflection, spiritual practice. And again, sometimes that was ecumenical, just because those are small communities and everybody knows everybody there. They're together in other community events. So they're together in some of their spiritual development too, which I thought was really neat.
Mhm. Great. And then joyful, we've talked about that already. It reminded me of Philippians 4:8 that says, whatever is true, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So the focus on the joyful, the positive versus the worried, the tired, the fearful attitudes. If a newcomer comes into church, they will pick up on those attitudes immediately. And if they sense worry, weary, or fear, they will probably not be back. And also appreciative inquiry, that process of where you try to identify your strengths and make decisions based on what you have rather than what you lack. You know, we need more members, we need more money. So you're focusing on what you lack, but instead focus on what you have. Out of the gifts of who's there, what can you offer? You know, it's a very different way of discerning based on gifts already present. Tammy.
I would add to that those that where the joy came out was with people who told me that their mission was to build a better world, and that they faced challenges as opportunities for learning and growth. And specifically examples of that would be in Maple Creek and Balzac, both of whom, Maple Creek found themselves for several years without ministry personnel. And the lay leadership stepped up, and a couple of retired ministers supported, but there was all kinds of lay leadership. And when I was visiting with them, they were celebrating the learning and the experience from that. And the same with Balzac. Their minister very suddenly had an injury and could not work for a few months. And again, folks celebrating how, it was a challenge. We learned and grew spiritually from it, from meeting that challenge. And that was a real joy.
Yeah, great. Is that good, Tammy?
Yep.
Yeah, good. All right, good. And so then we moving to communal. I did mention they really enjoyed being together. They would eat together as often as they could. Some churches ate together every Sunday after church. They would choose fundraisers that would best build community. And so often they were meal related kind of fundraisers. A lot of guess who's coming to dinner kind of fundraisers. Because the communal building was as important as the fundraising. Tammy.
This, for my experience here, was again, same thing, food at everything, but also food became an ecumenical connector too. There were, for instance, in Carmen, there was a team of churches that worked to provide meals for folks who are isolated or lonely or needing company for mealtime. They would do that regularly. It always happened at Carmen United because the community came together to help them develop their kitchen so it could happen there. And why have 6 kitchens when you can put your resources into one, and all the denominations shared in that. Each dinner, different denomination took a turn leading, but again, it was about food and building community and resilience.
Great. Is that good? You tell me.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we move. We're just moving along here at a rapid rate. So again, you can listen to the recording again if you'd like, but we're trying to get as much in as we can, and then we'll invite you to do some reflection in a bit. So we move now to the following year, which came in with a crash in March, and it brought with us the COVID test. So once Tammy and I had caught our breath and trying to figure out what to do in our own communities, we then began to contact these other churches and found, in fact, every single church had met the COVID test and surpassed it. They are all continuing to thrive. That was, to me, the test. I mentioned about Richard Rohr. Some of the churches, and I think Hillhurst is one of them, realized that they could do more small groups through Zoom than they could in person. And so they have actually increased the number of adult educational opportunities that they can offer. Many of them, many of them, including Red Deer Lake, just outside of Calgary, are discerning. Well, at that point, we're discerning. I'm sure they know now what they've added and created by necessity do they actually want to keep? What is actually improving their ministry? And so many of the churches are beginning to look at that question as opposed to, oh, we can hardly wait till we can go back. Well, some of these churches are saying, we're not going back. We will pick up some things for sure that we were able to do before, but there's other things we want to keep. A lot of them have said Zoom meetings might continue, at least in some form, in some of them, and they will be able to offer more of those. One of those is a group that's now meeting weekly to discuss Richard Rohr's daily emailed meditations. And I think that's actually a wonderful thing that I will probably be offering at Westworth following our Lenten study. It doesn't require any preparation on behalf of those leading the groups. It could be led by anyone. It doesn't have to be a minister. It's simply a discussion on the tremendously rich material that Richard Rohr provides every day. So that's another idea that I've just picked up. I found that the churches that had already developed their spiritual foundation and were able already to listen for those whisperings of the divine, were able to focus on faith and hope out of their identification of what is positive, what's working, helped their ability to stay in the moment, not be lost in regret for what's missing or buried in the worries of the future, what may or may not come. The ability to stay in the moment it was proving crucial to these churches to continue to thrive, responding to the possibilities of now. Like Tammy had mentioned, looking at some of these challenges as opportunities has really helped. And then, of course, very creative ways to retain community, such as drive-by birthday celebrations and things like that. Tammy, what did you find?
I found with the rural congregations, the big challenge became technology, because many of them don't have or didn't already have live streaming or recorded worship. Many do not have the internet capacity to do live streaming. Some were recording and posting, but all those things, it became early on in COVID, there became quickly a shortage of, like, go to your Best Buy and we're out of reasonably priced cameras for recording and out of the sound things that you needed. I know there was very early on kind of a high demand for those things. And for rural congregations, it just threw in another challenge, especially in smaller communities where there wasn't necessarily a technical savvy person on site. Mm-hmm. So it's been a high learning curve mm-hmm. for some of our rural folks, but not an insurmountable one. Again, that's where our regions have been good support in helping educate or support or take people where they need to go. There's been online offerings, but the challenge has been in the technology. We will find a way to make this work. Good old telephone has been very important in rural areas. Lots of telephone trees to check in on people and address the isolation that has been a huge part of COVID.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found is I found some inspiration in, and again, I will go to Charleswood United for an example of this in Winnipeg. They were the only church I visited of the rural ones, of the urban ones, that had not gone online prior to COVID. So it took them a little while to get online, but when they did, they started filming worship in other places besides the church. So they, for instance, have been part of interfaith sponsorship of Yazidi refugees. And they filmed a worship service from a field where they were harvesting. A farmer had offered the field for the Yazidis to plant their food and harvest for themselves and to sell to raise money. So that was I thought that is so creative. So it gave me an idea to offer one of our services filmed at West Broadway Community Ministry, which is the community outreach we support at Westworth, and have the whole service there. Our church is passionately dedicated to that ministry, but most of them have never been there, never seen it. So it allowed our church to actually have interviews with some of the guests who came in, look at the surroundings, the inside of what it looked like, and it made that ministry more real for us. So I am learning a lot, and that's another thing. Like, what is the opportunity this is presenting? How can we offer worship in a way that we can't, when it is going back to in person? Tammy, any other things you want to add?
I will add the creative response. A couple of places have found that in places where they were locked down, like the senior centers and things, we've been using Zoom there, and the opportunity to offer worship in those other settings. Again, it's been a learning curve, but they're connecting to their computer system to the television, so residents can watch. I've said to a few people, how many of us, when we did our theological training, knew that we would become video stars? but that's what COVID has been doing, not just for the ministry personnel, but the techie stars are the important ones, important too. Most of the congregations I visited weren't even doing PowerPoint in worship yet. So you get a sense of and for the congregations that I visited, doing worship on Zoom is really hard to get the music timed, and so that's been a challenge. But one of the gifts that's come out of this is the number of faith communities that do have musical, technical capabilities that have posted music to share with other churches has been a gift. Also, the gift of, in rural areas, when your ministry personnel does take a holiday, the pulpit supply also includes a large mileage bill usually. Well, some of us in rural ministry have had the gift of being able to invite our congregations to go online and experience someone else's worship while we're away. And so pulpit supply costs, it's been a way to help balance. We've lost, many of the rural churches have lost rental income because our buildings are quite often used by other community groups. And so it's a way to offset some of that loss of income too. So that's one of the COVID test things that's happened.
Great. So now, Tammy, take us into our small group.
I will do that. Yeah. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we do want to invite you to move into those groups, and Stephen's going to use his magic to do that. So you'll be in groups of folks from your congregation, if there's others from your congregation on, and the rest that are on without other congregants, you'll be randomly put in a group. And what we'd like to ask you to do in those groups is to look at some of the attributes that we've talked about and talk about how they're being lived out in your church. Are those attributes, are you seeing them in play in your church? And then
Tammy, I'm wondering, just because of time, maybe we should just leave it at that one question. What do you think?
Sure, yeah. And if you have a little bit of time, the other two are
go ahead.
Are how might you, what might be something new you'd like to try in your church?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Thanks.
So I have put into the chat tonight's attributes, just so you have the titles, because it'll help you remember.
Okay, thank you.
And I have put the questions.
Oh, perfect.
And I have done my best to put you into cohort groups. If I've screwed up, I'm sorry, but please talk to the people you find yourself with, because we've got 44 small groups here. Zoom will allow 50, so we're just about
Wow.
maxing out the technology. And as long as you signed in with your church's name and didn't change it afterwards, I think I've got it right. So are we still talking 25 minutes, or do you want to be a little shorter? Why don't we say 20 minutes, and then we'll have time to debrief.
20 minutes is good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let me change that to 20 minutes. Friends, when you get into your small group, you will notice up in the top right corner, there's a countdown clock that will show you how much time is left in your small group. We'll give you 20 minutes, and then it's just about exactly top of the hour now. So at 20 minutes past the hour, we'll come back together and we'll debrief for a few minutes, and then talk about what's happening next week. When I push the button, you will get an invitation on your screen to join a group. Please say yes. And Loraine and Tammy, you're going to be in group 44 by yourselves, and I will join you in case, unless somebody asks me for help. Down in the bottom right corner, there's a button that says, "Oh my God, it's not working, Steve," except I think it says "call the host for help." So feel free to use that if you need to. Push the button and I will come as soon as I can to your small group and figure out and unravel whatever problem you're having. I've been keeping a list of the questions that perhaps Tammy and Loraine didn't address, and I will show those questions to Tammy and Loraine when we're in our small group, so they might have a chance to respond to those when we're here. Dave says he's not seeing the questions in the chat. I'm seeing them. There's one at 7:58 that says tonight's attributes: inspirational worship, spiritual formation, contemplative, joyful, and communal. And then another one also at 7:58 with the 3 questions. That chat persists. So when you get into your small groups, open the chat and you should see the same chat that you've just seen here.
You scroll to the bottom. It's at the very bottom of the chat.
Oh, and David is seeing it now. Perfect. Thank you, David. Any other last minute questions before I push the button? Have fun. We'll see you in 20 minutes. It's not allowing me to put anybody else in. I think it's just because we've maxed out the number of groups that are possible. So
Okay.
let's have some conversation among ourselves. And folks, you can open your mics at this point because I've taken away the prohibition. So is there anything in what we've heard that you'd like to kind of push back on for the next 15 minutes, or anything that sort of grabbed you in what they said? And we'll just have a bit of a conversation with the 20 of us or so who are here.
And I invite you, if you can, to both unmute yourselves if you like, but also turn your picture on and change your view to gallery view instead of speaker view, and then we can see everyone.
Sure.
Some people's bandwidth may not allow the video to come on, and that's fine. And any questions anyone has?
You know, I'll just say something I put in the chat. I'm Roseanne.
Sure.
Here.
Hi, Roseanne.
Even like when I'm in a role, I'm a minister. When I'm in a role, I have to be active and friendly and hospitable, etc. But when I'm checking out a church, I'm a little church mouse, and I slip in, and I just need to, like, I'm the kind of person that doesn't jump in the pool, but tests the water little by little by little. So when you said, as soon as you walk into that church, they're going to put you into an active position, like, I would be out of there. I would it's not my way.
Yeah. So okay. So I can. It was striking to me the number of people that, even as I was walking to the meeting, took me aside and said, "You need to know that no one can sit in the pew in this church." I mean, so many people said that to me in that one church. I was struck with it. However, I don't think it meant grab them and shove them in a committee and get.
Hello.
I think
Hello.
Hello.
I don't seem to be in the group. I'm with you guys.
Okay, sorry. We had problems with Zoom. I think we maxed out the number of groups that were possible. So those of us who didn't end up in a small group, we're just having a fairly large plenary discussion. There's about 23 of us here. I'm sorry that we couldn't get you into the right group. I apologize for that.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so just to continue, Roseanne, I think what they were saying was, as soon as you come, you will find yourself welcomed and included in. It could just be a lunch group that was meeting for lunch, or it didn't mean you were set to work right away necessarily, but you were invited to all sorts of things, and you could say yes or no. But there is definitely a sense of being included, if that helps. Another person said to us that the challenge is how to be welcoming without being creepy. There's a fine line, right?
And in the, from the rural perspective, the congregations I visited, when I talked to them about how do they engage people, they all very clearly said, you know, when someone new comes, like, we're a small church, we all know they're new, but they also kind of have an unwritten policy that we let those folks get to know us before we ask them to, you know, sit on a committee or be involved in something, unless they offer or volunteer themselves. They take their time to let those people feel at home first before they.
Yeah. It certainly requires a high level of intuition. So those who are intuitive might best be the ones who would be in charge of that particular part of the ministry. How to know, you know, how to sense people's comfort or what they want. And if they just want to sit for a bit, you know, that's great. They're welcome to. But it's important to get the right people in those welcoming positions.
But I did really like that idea of inviting people to explore what their own gifts are. And it may be, it may not be a engagement, that reminding people that we do all have a responsibility if we're part of a church to be part of a church, and finding, you know, what's meaningful for us. I think is a good way to present that.
Yeah.
I guess relative to talking about our own church experience, we are a church in transition. We had a minister for about 33 years in our church, Reverend Ian Smith, and he retired. And slightly before that, a longtime organist, he had to retire as well. And so there's been big change in how things are going. You know, there was a bit of a Sunday school going on, and that right now it's really the older congregation and some of the younger ones, which, well, Judy and I are grandparents, and so we're kind of the younger crew that are at the church. And so there has been a real change in the dynamics. And this is with that and going through it, you know, I'm chair of the board and I've helped with search committee. We do have a new minister come in, and so it's kind of searching at now. There just seems to be one more thing that's changed, you know, with dealing with COVID. That has really been what's come up. And so I'm really appreciating some of the comments that have gone on. I know in the past we did have, you know, Judy and I were very involved in music. We did have an alternate music group. We used to, when we did have a Sunday school, we were doing, it was made a great difference that once a month we'd come in and do the new songs and something like that. And that had a great meeting to bring in additional people. But at the same time, as inviting as our congregation is, there's often that statement about really glad you've got suggestions and things you'd like to do, but then we'd really like you to do it this way.
Yeah.
Which, you know, let's put in a sanitizer in the kitchen. Well, why would we need that? And, you know, there's just things like that I realize that people, you know, that we don't have the same draw. There's a big community that we used to do a variety show, really. Then that was years ago, Hog and Snort, and it was kind of how it marked our community, because it meant for all those that wouldn't necessarily come for Sunday service, you had this big community people going and coming to do that production that was a big fundraiser. And it's been many years since that was on. It's been like 8 or 8 or 10 years, I think, Judy, maybe, yeah, longer. Yeah, that's it. Well, I've been going to the church since about 20 years. And so it was some time after.
Mhm.
And so, there is a lot of big changes that I realize we've gone through. So it's,
So I want to comment on one thing you mentioned, and that was about the newcomers and change. One of the ministers I talked with said, if you are afraid of change, you are afraid of newcomers.
Mhm.
So that is a really strong message to take back to the church. If newcomers come with some suggestions that might change things, then the church needs to think seriously, do they want newcomers?
Mhm. Mhm. The other point I'll raise is just, you talked about having a new minister, and I feel for ministry personnel who are parachuting into congregations during COVID, because the traditional ways of getting to know your congregation just aren't there. And even simple things like putting names to faces, thank goodness we have Zoom, but it excludes many, particularly the elder generation that aren't on Zoom as comfortably. So it's those it's almost like cold call telephone calls as a salesperson in trying to get to know your community when you can't worship together.
Yeah.
And so my heart goes out to those ministry personnel that are making changes in pastoral relationship in these times, and to congregations who need to welcome them in different ways too.
And not just new ministers. I mean, I've been in my church for a long, long time. But what I'm missing are all the informal conversations before and after worship. All of the conversations that aren't important enough to pick up the phone, but really are important. And because I'm not hearing them, I don't know what's going on in people's lives in the same way. And it's tough. That's the piece I haven't figured out how to replace.
Stephen, that's why I'm going to every little Zoom gathering I can find.
Yep. And it helps.
It
It
does.
helps a lot. And we're doing all kinds of them in my church. We're having cooking classes, and we've got Bible study, and we've got a daily prayer, Lectio Divina group, and a variety of different ways to collect people together, because every time we do it, we get a different constellation of people, and I see them and they see me. That helps. And every committee is still meeting, so we're having all our committee meetings on Zoom, and a lot of my really elderly folks are coming in by telephone, so we can at least hear each other's voices. But it's tough. It's all about relationship in a small church, and my goodness, it's tough to keep those going.
Indeed. Yeah, I was very amused this past Sunday. We have had before Christmas, we had in service, and our minister did notice the regular attendee that he was at the Zoom service, and she hadn't expected him. And she said, "Oh, Merv, I didn't recognize you without a mask." and and it was just it just was pure joy. And our new minister, she is young, and so there is going to be a lot of natural change and willingness to change that will come from that. And so I'm looking forward to it, but it is extremely hard in these times to really well, I think there was a lot of hope that when we came through, new minister, and by the time we get this year, everyone says we'll have the vaccinations, and then we can go from there. Well, we're realizing this is not. We're going to be in a time before things get any sort of normality. So it's going to be a struggle.
I opened our church in Toronto for in-person worship for those who wanted to come last September when the numbers were down, and we had 6 people. They didn't want to come. They were scared. And Toronto, even when the numbers were down, was still dangerous, and we weren't allowed to have church. So the parents with kids didn't want to have their kids squirming beside them, and the elderly people didn't want to come out, and that didn't leave very many. So complicated.
Yeah, well,
Maybe
when
for
we
all-
did, when we opened up in September, we're in Quebec, and so we did open up to the, there were a few times we bounced up to our 25 limit.
Yeah.
So that kept pretty, because we were established in September and kept through, there was times that after that, that we still continued through. But once it hit in December, that, you know, we were doing the isolation and way things are in Quebec right now. We're not, you know, even though they've opened up to 10, I think now, we said no for 10, you know, we'd have to make choices about who could come and not. So it's really try to perpetuate, you know, because if you got 20 coming and you can only do 10, that's tough. That's tough choices, and it's hard to manage.
Flip side of it is that we've had former members from other provinces who are connecting with us again, and people who are connecting from all over Canada because they have some historic relationship to the church, and then they found us, and so we're reestablishing old relationships, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So Stephen, we're at almost 20 after I wonder if we should.
The groups have 4 minutes left, so I'm
4
kind of
minutes.
watching the clock here.
Oh, 4 minutes left.
I think because it took me a while to get the
Yeah.
group going,
Oh,
we
okay.
fiddle-faddled around for a bit, and I apologize for that.
All right, we can't hasten that.
They're all watching their countdown clock, so I don't want to stop them
Stop
early.
that. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So my
Yeah.
mother, if we have 4 minutes left, I would like to hear from anyone who has not yet spoken in this group. Any comments and questions, any particular, what the other groups are talking about are attributes that you've heard that you might want to focus, maybe choose one that you think your church might want to consider a little more.
So I was thinking about that when you talked about the contemplative, which is one which I find, while we're attracted to it, we're not very good at doing it sometimes. Like we like to bounce up and down, and as soon as we're passing the piece, we're all running around and talking to each other. We don't sit still and quietly very much, and I'm really curious about ways to encourage that.
It is very difficult. It is a discipline. It's a spiritual discipline, and it does require practice, but also education. So there are ways to introduce it that are sort of brief and not as difficult. Like, for instance, there's something called the reset breath. I often do that. It's where you simply let your breath out and don't breathe in again until your body says you have to. It's like turning the computer on and off, right? And so it's to me, it's a way of sort of calming, stilling the mind, not putting, breath brings energy, right? Usually we don't want energy. We want to kind of bring ourselves down and let that energy sort of exude a bit. And in that, we're making space, I think, for the spirit and for one another's ideas. So it's a very simple thing. Some people can do that for almost a full minute. They don't have to breathe in again, and others can't. But even that very simple, like there's all sorts of, well, actually, what I've included in the book are a few pages of different spiritual practices and different ways to pray. So in that, you might find some introductions into how to take us into a bit more contemplation. Silence. One committee, they're afraid to pray. One of the committees in the church I serve. And so what they have done is simply have silence for even a half a minute, which is a long time for silence, but they are simply still. And in that stillness, even without words, we make room for the spirit, right? So that's, and they just chose that on their own to do that, because everyone was too afraid to say anything in the prayer. So it sort of just happened that they were ahead of the curve in beginning more of a contemplative approach to prayer. Yeah.
And I in my own congregations, I build into our prayers of the people silence. A few moments of silence, just prior to moving into the Lord's Prayer. We take a few moments of silence just to reflect and lift up our inner prayers.
And Tammy, do you
And
do that online? Like, you're online now, right? Or
no,
No, you're not. No,
No.
that's right. That's right. Sorry, I know that. I know
no,
that.
but we're worshiping very small. There's 8 to 10 in the one pastoral in the one congregation, and 10 to 12 in the other.
Mhm.
And we still do that. And I post my printed worship online, and I include that. Take that moment of silence in your reflecting as you're reading the worship service.
Let me
So
interrupt to
it's
say
there
that
for.
the folks in the breakout rooms are going to start joining us now.
Oh, good.
Their rooms are closing.
Oh, there's Betty. I didn't see you before. There's so many people on here. I have no idea who's on.
Yeah.
That's great.
I know my sister's on here somewhere.
Oh, I haven't seen Gail. That's great.
No, I saw her sign on, but I haven't seen her face yet. So.
Okay.
Great session. Thank you. I'll mute and keep out of the way here.
Thanks, Betty.
Hi, Tammy and Loraine. It's Mervyn Gallant.
Hi, Mervyn. How are you?
Yes, hi.
I did see your face a while ago as I was scrolling through. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And hi, Tammy. I don't know whether you recognize me or not.
Doreen, somebody.
Doreen
Is it-
Cott.
Oh my
Hi,
goodness.
Tammy.
Hello.
You
Hi,
probably just
Tammy.
I
You-
got golden hair color. That's probably why.
Oh my goodness. I have different hair color too, Doreen.
I noticed that. That's lovely.
So,
Okay.
Stephen,
I'm
are we
going
all
to
back?
call us to order, folks, because all of our groups are back now.
We're back
and
now.
thank you
Okay,
for
good.
that. My apologies to those of you who didn't get in the group the way that we expected you to. I thought we had the ability to have 50 groups, and I'm not sure what happened, and I will find out for next week. But in the meantime, thank you. And we have a few minutes left just to kind of debrief some of the learnings and thoughts that came out of the group. So Tammy and Loraine, over to you. And if people would give us an extra 4 or 5 minutes because I screwed up with the groups, I'd be grateful. But otherwise, I'll understand if you've got something else planned.
All right. Well, there's 2 questions I saw in the chat box I might address, and maybe Tammy had some ideas too. One was the question of the average size of the churches that we visited. The average, well, I would not say there was an average size. They were all over the map for me. We went from, none of them were big. They all were, and it was interesting. Some of our largest United churches, I won't say all because I didn't look at all of them, but the one that I looked at in particular was actually decreasing in membership. So to me, they didn't make the list, even though they're large, right? So the size didn't matter. We had small churches, we had medium, most of them were, I'd say, medium-sized churches that I visited, and I think Tammy would be small. So size really didn't matter. Another question was Sunday worship central? I would say it was to these churches. Some of them had different worship services, so at least one worship service would be central. So yes, I would say that that's pretty important. Tammy, what do you think?
I would Sunday certainly central. In the rural settings, special services like Week of Prayer for Christian Unity and Lenten worship and a few of those. And someone raised the question about ecumenism in rural areas being an important factor. And it is, I think, the most rural communities, part of it is the idea of critical mass. You can do more with more people and serve a wider community. And a lot of the rural congregations are not a lot of young people. So many hands that are elderly make work easier. So
Yeah.
a lot of community involvement was really, really important, and reaching out. That was part of the mission, right? To reach the wider community, you do it together.
Yeah. There was another question about were they minister driven or congregational driven, something like that. We'll actually be talking about that in another session. So we'll save that. We'll get to that question, but it'll come up later.
So y'all have to come back.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. One person asked about how to develop a contemplative spirituality. And we in our group of those who were left stranded, unable to join a small group, we talked a bit about that. And we talked about some ideas. In the book, there is a few pages of different types of prayer that could be used and tried that might help with that. It takes education, it takes practice, it takes discipline. And all of which I am totally committed to personally, because what a difference it makes if I can stay with that. Other people know around me, especially my partner, if I have not been able to do that, stay with it that day or the next day. But there are some ideas there. Tammy, where are we now? What were we going to do at the end? I think it's over to you.
Yeah, we were just gonna close with a bit of a closing blessing, but there was something that just came up on the chat asking what book we keep referring to.
Oh, okay.
Well, and so let me do that, because I think that's fair. And the other thing I wanted to do two things. I wanted, first of all, to remind people that what we're getting in this fire hose of information is information about a book that that these folks have written, mostly Loraine, but I think Tammy has written it too. And the book is hot off the press. It's brand new. It arrived in the bookstore yesterday. So we have arranged for a 20% discount for anybody who has registered for this webinar. And if you weren't the person who registered and didn't realize that it was there in your confirmation of registration, go back and find that, because 20% off, and you can go to the United Church UCRD store. The link is in that confirmation of registration email, and you can purchase their book by in ebook or in soft cover with a 20% off on the promo. I found when I read it that it was, like tonight, a kind of fire hose of ideas. And it just sparked my own imagination about what I could be doing or encouraging in the congregation that I lead. So this isn't a recipe, follow these rules and it will work every time. What it did instead was spark imagination. So if you've enjoyed tonight, then I would say that's the next step, and go and have a look. And otherwise, I just wanted to remind you that those are the spiritual attributes these folks have been talking about. We've looked at the first set tonight, and we have 2 more in the series. So we hope you'll come back next week to talk about the next 3, discerning, innovative, and collegial. And then 2 weeks hence, to close off the session with, what does it mean to be radically hospitable? What does it mean to be mission focused? And what does it mean to offer public witness? So that's where we're going. And I'll see if we can get the small group thing worked out. And if we can't, we'll do something different with the number of small groups that Zoom will allow us to have.
Great.
So there's my commercials, Tammy. So do you want to close us out?
Sure, I will just.
Still register, says Irene. Yes, absolutely they can.
Yes.
Sure.
I will just add to that. Yes, Loraine wrote the book, and I just added rural perspective. And I think, I'm not sure I heard you say, Stephen, but I want people to know that when you buy this book, you are supporting the Mission and Service Endowment Fund. That's where all the proceeds will be going. And so do buy the book and buy one for a friend.
Yeah. So yeah, no, Loraine and Tammy are not taking royalties. That's what she's saying. All of their royalties are going to the Mission and Service Fund. And thank you to the United Church Foundation that's doing the work, the heavy lifting around that. That's a wonderful gift that they've given the church.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing, if you've got a comment or something that might be helpful for us to do or change or switch up for next week, feel free to stick that in the chat so that we are aware of that. And I will just, our time is up, and I do want to thank you all for being here. Who knew that there would be 170 people coming and joining us? That's
actually
truly amazing.
It actually hit 200.
Oh, wow. So
I think we broke it. It's what we did today.
So I'm really appreciative of that. This is my first experience of co-facilitation on Zoom. So thank you for being a part of that with us tonight. And I would just wish you God's blessing as you go and continue this week to be light and love and hope for your congregations. Blessings all to you and have a lovely evening.
Amen.
Go in peace.
And we will see you next week.
Thanks.
See you next week.